Welcome, dear friend, once again. In our previous teleconference sessions, we were discussing about the pulmonary thromboembolism. In the last sessions, we have discussed about the definitions, about the signs and symptoms like breathlessness, tachypnea, and important investigation like ECG changes and pulmonary angiogram, CT scan, all these things. In these sessions, we will be discussing on the management component of the pulmonary thromboembolism. Although in our previous sessions we have discussed little bit of the management component of the pulmonary thromboembolism, in these sessions we will continue further ahead of that previous discussion. So I would like to request Dr. Bhatia to continue from the previous sessions.
Thank you, Dr. Biplab. Actually, before we just left, we had a brief discussion on the initial management of patients of pulmonary thromboembolism. Now, coming to the various thrombolytic regimens which are available, a large number of agents, as we all know, are nowadays available. But the vogue now is to use more fibrin-specific agents like a tissue plasminogen activator. The other non-fibrin-specific agent which has been largely used in pulmonary thromboembolism is urokinase. So urokinase and tissue plasminogen activator are the two main drugs which are often used. The various doses are as discussed in this particular slide. Now, one would think as to which drug should one use if one is faced with a patient of thromboembolism. Now, as far as the Food and Drug Administration of US is concerned, the only approved drug is Altiplase. 100 milligrams is given by infusion over a period of 2 hours. One has to discontinue heparin if that has already been started, and check APTT at the end of infusion. If less than 80 seconds, restart heparin without a bolus. If it is more than 80 seconds, recheck after 4 hours. In fact, these fibrin-specific agents do require you to use heparin alongside. Whereas other drugs like streptokinase, usually heparin is not given alongside, but agents like TPA would require heparin to be used. The other agent which is used is urokinase, a very good dose to remember, very easy to remember, quite unique in dosing, so you will never forget. So please remember 4,400 units per kilogram bolus, then 4,400 units per kilogram per hour infusion. Just remember this 4400 and you will never forget it in your life, because what happens is invariably you are so used to seeing patients of acute MI and remembering the dose of 1.5 million units of STK, in acute MI, that you often forget the dose in pulmonary thromboembolism. And once a patient of pulmonary thromboembolism comes, everybody is looking at the book trying to find out what is the dose. So just remember 4400, very easy to remember. Urokinase, easily available, a bit expensive, but easily available, and the dose is right in front of you, which you can remember. Now, supposing if the patient has got some, bleeding diathesis and is not a candidate for thrombolytic therapy, what do you do? The surgical options which are available is open surgical embolectomy. In the MAPET registry, it was found that almost 40% patients have got some amount of contraindication to fibrinolysis. In the ICOPER patients, it was found that patients who received fibrinolysis, 21.7% had major bleed, 3% had in fact intracranial bleeds. And since ICOPER is more like a controlled trial type of a setting, if you come to real world registries means what is happening in real day practice. In fact, there might be higher complication rates. So fibrinolytic therapy, although very effective, is not so easy to give. Often patients might have some form of contraindication. So what do you do in such cases? So either you have to have some form of surgical option or some percutaneous option. In the surgical arm, you have an open surgical embolectomy. Large amount of data shows that it has got very high survival rates, and it can be done on a warm beating heart without aortic cross clamping, cardioplegia or fibrillatory arrest. Blind instrumentation should be avoided, and extraction should be limited to the clot which is visible. Now, this is a diagrammatic representation of an open surgical embolectomy where a forceps has been introduced it's a common bile duct forceps, in fact very easy, has been introduced into a main incision which has been made on the MPA. The edges have been retracted and the clots have been removed. See the massive large clots which are often retrieved from patients who are subject to open surgical embolectomy. And once you are off with these clots, the patient is going to improve drastically. Now, if supposing surgical embolectomy were not available and patient is having a contraindication to fibrinolytic therapy, what are the other things that are available? So catheter based techniques becoming very popular because of being non-invasive. can be used. A few tertiary centers, however, can offer such services around the clock, and catheter embolectomy is usually helpful. These are the usual indications as far as for massive pulmonary thromboembolism are concerned. Now, what is an ideal device? Several devices are available in the market. An ideal device is one which is highly maneuverable to allow rapid right heart passage and advancement into the major pulmonary arteries, is effective in removing obstructing thrombi from major pulmonary arteries to facilitate rapid improvement in hemodynamics and reversing the right heart failure and cardiogenic shock, and is safe without causing damage to the cardiac structures or the pulmonary arteries. One of the most commonly used is a greenfield embolectomy catheter. Basically can be introduced percutaneously. It has got a cup in front of it. You just take the cup and make it touch at the site of the embolus, create the negative suction, and just pull out the entire apparatus, and you will be out with the clot. The other devices that are available include the Aspirex pulmonary embolism catheter, the hydrodynamic thrombectomy device, and the thrombolyzer. The thrombolyzer is basically, it's like a rotablator type of a thing. It's got small blades which rotate at very high speeds, and they cause the pulverization of the clot and break the clot into smaller fragments, which might then embolize into the distal bed and cause removal of the acute obstruction. Now, this was what we were thinking about while dealing with patients who had got massive pulmonary thromboembolism. Suppose a patient has got a moderate or a small pulmonary embolism and no hemodynamic compromise. The mainstay treatment here obviously is not thrombolytic therapy. It is heparin or low molecular heparin, and followed by the patient can subsequently put on warfarin or acetron. Heparin and low molecular heparin are also indicated in massive PE after stabilization with embolectomy or thrombolysis. You have to maintain an activated partial thromboplastin time of 1.5 to 2.5 and continue it for a period of 7 days. Once you have started the heparin or the low molecular heparin, it's very important that the overlap with warfarin should happen quite early, because for these oral anticoagulants to get their entire effect, it takes 5 to 7 days. If suddenly you start warfarin one day without giving any overlap with heparin, you can have a paradoxically hypercoagulable state. So please overlap warfarin treatment with heparin. The overlap should be for at least 5 days and 5 to 7 days, because that is the time that is required for warfarin or acetron to take their entire effect. You should aim for an INR of 2 to 3. Now, coming to the various doses of heparin which are used, as we have discussed earlier, several regimens are available. The most commonly used normogram is called the Rashke's normogram, in which 80 units per kilogram bolus is given, followed by 18 units per kilogram per hour. Subsequently, every 4 hourly or every time the dose of heparin has been changed, you should check for the activated partial thromboplastin time. And subsequently, if activated partial thromboplastin is less than 35 seconds, give another bolus and increase the infusion by 4 units per kilogram per hour. If it is between 35 to 45, again it means that the levels are subtherapeutic. Rather than giving an 80, give a 40 units bolus, followed by increasing the infusion by a lesser rate of 2. We are targeting a APTT of 46 to 70 seconds. If you find that your APTT is 46 to 70, no need to do anything. Just continue your 18 units per kilogram per hour infusion which is going on. If you find that the APTT is a bit on the higher side, 71 to 90 seconds, decrease the rate of infusion to 2 units per kilogram per hour. If you find that your APTT has crossed 90 seconds, the bleeding risk is going to be much higher. So hold the infusion for 1 hour and then decrease infusion by rate of 3 units per kilogram per hour. Again, repeat the APTT after 4 hours, and then depending upon the PTT what you find, the next step can be taken. The US FDA has in fact approved low molecular heparin basically for treatment of DVT rather than pulmonary embolism often, but patients with small amounts of pulmonary embolism can also be given low molecular heparin. Several agents available: enoxaparin, deltaparin, nadroparin, reviparin, tinzaparin. Most commonly used and easily available is enoxaparin, popularly known by the name of Flexane, and deltaparin, which is easily available and known by the name of Fragmin. The dose is 1 milligram per kilogram twice daily or 1.5 milligram per kilogram once daily. Supposing if you have used enoxaparin once, please don't change to deltaparin for the next dose. Go for only one low molecular heparin and continue that. The advantages of low molecular heparin are several fold. They don't need any regular monitoring of APTT. However, it is a bit of an issue to use low molecular heparin in patients who are elderly, above 80 years of age, and patients who have got renal dysfunction. You have to modify doses of low molecular heparin in such patients. Otherwise, low molecular heparin is very safe, no monitoring is required, can be given easily, and can be given subcutaneously also. As far as oral anticoagulants are concerned, warfarin, main long stay of treatment, as already mentioned, should be overlaid with heparin, and you have to maintain an INR of 2 to 3. The only condition in which higher INRs are required is the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, where you have to maintain an INR of 3.5. Now one would feel how long to give the warfarin. If this is a first episode with a reversible factor, 3 to 6 months. First episode with no identifiable factor, at least for 6 months. Associated with some primary hypercoagulable state, at least for 12 months. And if patient is having recurrent thrombosis, patient should be at least given for 12 months or even longer. So duration of this treatment is also very important. It should neither be undertreated nor should it be overtreated. Now, what are the other modalities that are available? Supposing a patient came to you and has got extensive deep vein thrombosis, which is extending in the lower limbs, and now it has come into the iliacs and is now extending into the IVC. What do you do? A very good option to protect such patients is to put in intravenous inferior vena cava filters. Now, filters can be put in through two routes. One is the femoral venous route and other is the jugular route. The filters which are put through the jugular route are usually temporary. You can put it, and once the acute phase is over and patient is mobilized, you could remove it. The other filters which are usually placed from the femoral route are usually permanent filters. Once placed, they will remain there forever. The various indications for IVC filter use are where anticoagulation is contraindicated and pulmonary embolism has been documented, such as if the patient is having active bleeding that might cause exsanguination, for example GI bleed. Now what do? You can't give thrombolysis, you can't give heparin, you can't give warfarin. So go in and put an IVC filter. If you have feared bleeding that might be catastrophic, for example patient is post-op craniotomy and is going to be bedridden for a long period of time. Now what do? You can't put the patient on heparin. So you can put an IVC filter that will be protective. If patient has ongoing complications from anticoagulation, HIT, heparin induced thrombocytopenia, if patient is planned for intensive cancer chemotherapy. The second class of indications are anticoagulation failure despite documentation of adequate therapy. Supposing patient is having recurrent PE, what do you do? And prophylaxis in high risk patients, extensive or progressive venous thrombosis in conjunction with catheter based or surgical pulmonary thrombectomy, and severe pulmonary hypertension or cor pulmonale. Now this is a diagrammatic representation of an IVC filter. Bird's nest filter is often placed infrarenally, and it has got very low failure rates, have low thrombogenicity and occlusion. Temporary filters can be placed via jugular routes which are available. Now unfortunately this is not playing. If we could just escape this and I could show you from the AVI file. I'll just show you, just a second, just give me some time. Now if we could focus on this particular frame which is playing, could you please show us this? Yeah. Now this is from a young boy. You can see some fragmented materials. Actually this is a boy who has been shot by a bullet. There are multiple bullets fragments which are here, and these bullets have caused the patient to be immobilized for a long period of time, and patient has come with has come to us with deep venous thrombosis. See the multiple fragments of the bullets which are lying here. Now patient has also got fracture of the ribs, fracture of the vertebrae, and this patient has landed up with deep vein thrombosis. Now what do? The good option in these patients is to put in the IVC filter. I'll just play it again for you, and now you see again. Could we please focus on this? Now you see. Now this is the one catheter has been placed into the renal artery to give you an idea, because it has to be placed. So the renal vein will be somewhere here. Now this is the IVC filter which you will see now gradually. The IVC filter is getting released now. There you see the IVC filter comes in place, and this is going to stay permanently. Now coming back to our presentation of this wasn't playing. Yeah, could you have the next slide please? Now having seen that IVC filter in place, the other options that are available include things like balloon angioplasty. You can use small 6 to 16 millimeter balloons to crush the clots which are present. However, they can cause some distal embolization. Local thrombolysis has also been tried, and self-expanding stents are also available. Some of the future directions which are available are retrievable stents. However, these are only in experimental stages. Sheep experiments have been done in which compression of the embolic material by radial strength of the stent has been made. They are easily deployed and can be retrieved also, and they can be removed after 30 to 60 minutes after some thrombolytic therapy has been given or heparin has been given and flow has been re-established. Now, an important type of pulmonary thromboembolism that has found place and has often been reported is the air travel associated pulmonary embolism, also known as economy class syndrome, since it is more commonly found to be occurring in patients who are traveling by economy class. Now, as far as Virchow's triad is concerned, all three factors come into play once patient is in air. The patient has been sitting for a long time in an economy class seat which has got less space. So, the immobility is there, which is one of the main principal precipitating factors. Then once you are sitting for a long time and once the patient is airborne, the hypobaric environment of the aircraft itself increases the coagulation factors by 2 to 8-fold. The veins are known to release certain factors which cause venous stasis. Further, dehydration leads to hemoconcentration. There is decreased oxygen tension and ambient pressure within the chamber of the aircraft. This impairs fibrinolysis and activates the coagulation cascade. There is increased fluid retention causing swelling of legs, increased erythropoietin and circulating protein level. So all these cause a hypercoagulable state, and moreover these things are found to be occurring within an hour of being airborne. And the vessel lesions also result as a compression by the seat. So everything is happening: immobility or the stasis, hypercoagulable state, as well as the trauma. So all three components of Virchow's triad are there, and often people will go off to sleep for 5 hours, 6 hours in the aircraft, and once they get up, they invariably have pain which is present in the lower limbs, and subsequently as soon as they get up, the symptoms start. Usually all symptoms of air travel associated pulmonary embolism occur before the person enters into the airport chamber. It is either within the aircraft or within the jetway. There is a large registry in which passengers alighting at Frankfurt Airport as well as at Heathrow Airport were worked up for pulmonary embolism, and it was found that large number of patients have this problem, often overlooked. So have a high index of suspicion. And if you could have the next slide. Now, what are the preventive measures? What do you do to prevent such things? Because air travel is becoming much more cheaper and more people are doing. So certain measures that might help to prevent these unwanted complications include maintaining a high level of hydration, avoidance of alcohol, smoking and constrictive clothing, as well as leg crossing. Even when seated, one should frequently change position, move legs and undertake short walks in the aisle at regular intervals. In fact, one should stop taking the window seat and should take the aisle seat. Although it's more convenient and looks nice to sit at the window seat, but it's more safe to sit in the aisle. Wearing elastic compression stockings may be helpful, but possibly at the risk of inducing superficial vein thrombosis, so it is not recommended. Similarly, people feel that taking aspirin or a shot of low molecular heparin might prevent deep vein thrombosis. In air embolism has not been proven. So there are very simple ways of good hydration, avoidance of alcohol, frequent movement, frequently moving your legs even while seated, which can prevent this unwanted problem. I think that brings us to the end of our presentation of pulmonary thromboembolism. So, if there are any questions?
No, before ending, I would like to thank that our student from the Hyderabad, Mumbai and Kolkata sent me SMS, and student from Kolkata, Dr. K. Chaki, wanted to know that what are the different investigation modalities for the pregnancy in different trimester, because as your presentation also you said that pregnancy is the hypercoagulable state, so it may be the one of the risk factor. So moreover the fetus is inside the mother. So what are the treatment investigation modalities for the different trimester?
See, there is no specific investigation for a particular trimester, but definitely patients in pregnancy could present with thromboembolism. The investigations are the usual ones which are there for everybody, because patient will present with breathlessness. Now, common causes, one should look for the entire spectrum of the causes. In India especially, one common cause of breathlessness occurring during pregnancy is plain and simple anemia. Majority of the patients are anemic, so you should look for hemoglobin. Second thing what you should look for is rheumatic heart disease. Mitral stenosis often presents in pregnancy, usually towards the second or the third trimester, because that is the time when the circulating blood volume is very high. So one should look for these causes, and at the same time also keep the pulmonary thromboembolism in mind. Supposing a patient has, because of some obstetric problem, has been bedridden for a long period of time, that is the time when you can think that patient perhaps has a pulmonary thromboembolism. And doing a simple ECG, doing chest X-ray, obviously you would not like to do in a pregnant patient because of certain the risk various. A simple echocardiogram could give you the answer, and a D-dimer, because D-dimer is not known to be associated in pregnancy. So these simple tests, so there is no specific test which is there.
If in other way we ask what are the tests not to be done during the pregnancy?
The only test which are not to be done is your chest X-ray, especially during the first trimester, because they have teratogenic effects. Secondly, the second thing, even the CT scans have some degree of ionizing radiation. Now the thing comes like if you want to give some form of therapy, if you had and often you would which patients are at high risk during pregnancy to develop pulmonary embolism. They are usually patients who have got a bad obstetric history, patients who had antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, they have recurrent fetal loss. So that might again give you a clue. A patient, young patient coming with bad obstetric history, recurrent fetal loss, and had been having antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. There that this patient is at a high risk of pulmonary thromboembolism.
Is it in the same way like we think the investigation modality during the pregnancy state, the treatment modality also need to be changed, or is it the same thing?
No, the treatment, there are a couple of issues as far as the treatment modalities are concerned, because number one, giving warfarin is a bit of an issue during pregnancy, because it causes embryopathy. It is known to be associated with warfarin embryopathy, what is known as nasal hypoplasia, and other problems are there. So one has to be very careful. So initially perhaps you could place the patient on heparin, and then subsequently once the organogenesis, means the early part of the pregnancy has passed, you can then start warfarin, and during the last month of pregnancy and especially near the time of the labor, the patient can be re-switched back to heparin. Now if intravenous heparin is to be given, it's a bit of an issue, because then patient has to be in hospital. What do you do? So even low molecular heparin has been found to be effective, but one has to be very careful because all these increase bleeding risks. Low molecular heparin, one specific problem that has been found is that if patient goes for epidural anesthesia, if patient is on low molecular heparin, the chances of one developing intraspinal hematomas is also very high. So the patient has to be explained all these these problems well in advance, so that unwanted things can be taken care of, and the risks have been explained.
Thank you very much, sir. Before starting the second topic, there are questions from the Hyderabad students. They have asked especially for the maintenance of logbook related to the preventive cardiology. Regarding this, I would like to tell that I have already sent the logbook to all the students. If you don't receive, please write me email regarding that what are the logbook you didn't receive. So whatever logbook you have received, you have to fill up that case. Once you are going to the different camp, like all this activity need to be filled up in that logbook and need to be signed by your respective academic counselors. Beside this, about your term and practical examination, the term and practical examination, I have already told you that there will be date will be announced by your program in charge later on, and there will be 2 days examination. One internal examiner and one external examiner will be there, and like one short case, one long case, ECG, TMT, radiology, echo, all these things as well as biopsy will be definitely there. So these are the right now we can tell about the exam modalities regarding that. Later on definitely all these things will be properly communicated to all of you. So we have already finished one topic, that is pulmonary thromboembolism.
Yeah, I'll just have a word. I think we'll just tell them a bit about the echocardiography part
also. Sure.
Actually, I try to put in a few diagrams for you here, and so that you could just see. Actually, what I tried to show you is that normally if you take a parasternal, I think if you get a more closer picture, is it possible?
Yeah.
For us to have a more closer picture of this. If you could zoom in into this thing. Normally if you take a parasternal short axis view, you find that the RV is ellipsoid or a D shape, and the LV is the one which is more circular. But once you have pulmonary thromboembolism and the RA and RV get dilated, if you take a parasternal short axis view, you will find that this has got reversed. In fact, the RV starts looking bigger it looks more circular, and it is the LV which now starts looking D-shaped. If you take a apical 4-chamber view, you would find that the RA and the RV are dilated as is shown in this figure. Now once you go to the Doppler part, now you do find that the RA and RV are dilated. Now you would like to see whether any pulmonary arterial hypertension is occurring as a result of that. Then you could put in a continuous wave Doppler at the tricuspid valve and look for the TR jet. Now once you are obtaining a good TR jet, the next question comes as to what all pressures can be calculated. So as is there, the pulmonary artery has got a systolic pressure, it has got a diastolic pressure, and it's got a mean pressure. Now a pulmonary arterial systolic pressure can be calculated from the TR jet and the RA pressure. Now the TR jet you have already got here. Supposing this were 4 meters per second, the velocity was 4 meters per second. Then in that case, as we all know by Bernoulli's principle, that the pressure is P is equal to 4V square. So if you had a pressure of, if you had a velocity of 4 centimeters per second, your pressure will be 4V square, which is 4 into 16, that is 64 millimeters of mercury. So this is your TR jet PA pressure. Now how do you calculate the RA pressure? The second questions come, how do you calculate the RA pressure? This is very simple. Take a subcostal view, which I have tried to show here, and focus on the inferior vena cava and just take a M mode cut section. So you will start seeing the tracing of the inferior vena cava. Just take, and with inspiration and expiration, just take the size. Normally the diameter of the inferior vena cava is 1.2 to 2.3 centimeters. This is the normal diameter of the inferior vena cava, is 1.2 to 2.3 centimeters, and once one takes a breath, the collapse of the IVC is more than 50%. So if you had a normal sized IVC and more than 50% collapse inspiration, so that's all normal, so your RA pressure is about 0 to 5. If you have a normal sized IVC but collapse is less than 50%, your RA pressure is 5 to 10. If you have a dilated inferior vena cava, that is more than 2.3 centimeters, and however the collapse is normal, more than 50%, then your RA pressure is 10 to 15. And if you have a collapse which is less than 50%, which is, you know, everything is abnormal, the IVC is also dilated and your collapse is also less than 50%, then it is 15 to 20 milliliters mercury.
Collapse of IVC?
Collapse of the inferior vena cava. Once, normally what happens is, once you take inspiration, the IVC will collapse. Then with expiration, again it will expand. So you can take, you know, you can take your sizes here, you can take the sizes. Ideally you would need, you know, something to be placed at the nose which will help you to find out when the inspiration and the expiration is occurring. So take the size, and accordingly you could easily calculate the RA pressure. So you have a TR jet and a RA pressure. So you know both of them. The TR jet is available in the apical 4-chamber view, and your RA pressure you already got from the IVC, so you can easily calculate the pulmonary arterial systolic pressure. Now coming to the mean pulmonary arterial pressure and the diastolic pulmonary arterial pressure. Take a parasternal short axis view. The aorta will be seen in the center and the pulmonary artery will be opened up here. You have a PR jet, the pulmonary regurgitation jet. Now just pick it up and you will get a tracing like this. Your transducer is seeing from here, so obviously this jet is coming towards you, so it would be on the top part of the baseline, and this is the usual form which is formed. The mean pulmonary arterial pressure, just calculate the mean pulmonary arterial pressure from here. No need to add RA pressure. Okay, this is the mean pulmonary arterial pressure, and at the end here you would get the pulmonary arterial diastolic pressure. Here you would require to add the RA pressure to get the final value. So you have got everything. You have got RA, RV which are dilated. Patient is first of all very sick. Patient is highly tachypneic, he's got tachycardia, he's got some ECG evidence, there is a clinical scenario which is helping you to suspect. You get in an ECG, you find S1Q3, T3, quickly put in your echo probe, you know RA-RV are dilated, you have a high PA systolic pressure, you have a TR jet, you have a PR jet, your diagnosis is established. Depending upon what degree of hemodynamic compromise or what syndrome it fits into, you could decide your further line of management. So I think within a period of just 15 to 20 minutes, the entire diagnosis can be established, but you have to be quick. So I've tried to explain briefly. If you have any questions on this.
PA DP will be the smaller portion of the jet plus right atrial pressure.
Yeah, The PA diastolic pressure will be the smaller part of the chest plus RA pressure, and the mean pulmonary arterial pressure will be the higher part. You don't need to add any RA pressure in this. Okay, so you have all values, all your hemodynamics are available to you. Similarly, the LV function can also be assessed. You will be seeing the paradoxical motion of the the intraventricular septum. You will find that there will be apical sparing because McConnell sign will be seen. The McConnell sign is because the hypercontracting LV is pulling the RV apex towards itself. So it's it's just because of that you get McConnell sign where there is apical sparing. So these are important signs to look for, and we did show you that particular echocardiogram in which the patient basically had a large clot which was moving like this from RA to RV. These patients usually have got what are called grape-like clusters. They are often known as emboli in transit. They are emboli which are generated in the deep venous system of the legs and are migrating towards the pulmonary artery, and often you might pick them up en route. So what we did in this particular patient was, since the patient was at high risk, the surgeons were not willing to operate. So what we did was we gave him bolus of heparin and started him on thrombolytic therapy, and patient improved drastically. In fact, the next day when we did his echo, everything had gone away. So everything had got lysed, gone to the periphery, patient's hemodynamic had improved, the TR jet had come down, and patient was feeling much better. Now, one issue which has not been discussed by us is the how long to give the thrombolytic therapy. Should we just, now supposing if this patient you did the next day and you find that this has reduced markedly. Now what do you do? Should you continue the thrombolytic therapy? Should you put the patient back on heparin? What do you do? Now as we have discussed that thrombolytic therapy has got a high risk of bleeding. So you have to be prudent. Once you feel that patient has become hemodynamic stable, patient has started feeling better, beyond the period of 12 hours you have to be slightly more careful in giving thrombolytic therapy. If 12 hours have passed and you feel that patient has already started feeling better, stop the thrombolytic therapy and switch back the patient to heparin, either unfractionated or low molecular heparin. Okay, and subsequently then overlap it with warfarin, which will have to be continued at least for 6 months in this particular case. Right? I think we could now shift over to our next topic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bineet. You have described very well this topic called pulmonary thromboembolism, and I think our student will be they are already benefited by these discussions. And in this topic we are going to discuss about the etiopathogenesis of the acute coronary syndrome. Basically, acute coronary syndrome is composed of patients with the acute myocardial infractions with ST segment elevations on their presenting electrocardiogram, and those with the unstable angina and non-ST elevation of MI. It is one of the medical emergency because acute coronary syndrome is responsible for this death over around 10% or case. So this is the reason that we really need to learn this very thoroughly about this acute coronary syndrome. In this today we are not going to discuss about the pathogenesis, investigation or management component out of it, because the topic itself is very large. So we are going to discuss only etiopathogenesis, what are the causes for that acute coronary syndromes, and if the doctor can identify that acute coronary syndrome and intervention is available and can be applied on that patients, then definitely the mortality can be reduced drastically, and it is therefore need to be identified that acute coronary syndrome. So I would like to request Dr. Bineet again to discuss about this acute coronary syndrome, especially on the etiopathogenesis, because the topic itself is a very large.
Thank you so much, Dr. Biplab. The second topic again we are picking up today is of high practical importance. That is etiopathogenesis of acute coronary syndrome, another very common presentation to emergency department. As far as the treatment principles are concerned, everything stems from the etiopathogenesis. So it's very important for us to read about etiopathogenesis. Only then we could understand what are the principles of therapy. Now, a normal artery chiefly consists of three components. If we go from the luminal to the abluminal side, that is the tunica intima, the tunica media and the tunica adventitia, as we read in our MBBS books. The most important thing here is the endothelium. It is a very simple yet a very complex layer of single cells that plays a very important role in this whole process of acute coronary syndrome. Several risk factors like smoking, diabetes, dyslipidemia, especially elevated LDL, low protective HDL, obesity, hypertension, nutritional factors, inactivity, environmental and genetic factors all go on to promote atherosclerosis. What happens at the microscopic level is endothelial cell damage, and this puts into action a dangerous cascade of events subsequently leading to acute coronary syndrome. Now, a very important slide, looks very complicated but is very important to understand, because a large amount of all treatment principles are based on this. So it's very important for us to look at this slide. Once you come across in textbook, you'll say it looks too complicated and just overlook it. So it's very important to understand this particular slide. The first step is that within the circulation you have LDL. That's a low density lipoprotein, which is the bad cholesterol. Now this LDL gets internalized into the intima. That is the second step. In the presence of oxidative stress, this LDL gets modified by processes like oxidation and glycation and results in the formation of oxidized LDL. Now the yellow thing is the LDL, and you can see the one which is slightly browner, this is the modified or the oxidated LDL. This is the second step. Okay, fine. Okay. Yeah. Now this was the LDL, now this is the oxidized LDL. This has got oxidation and glycation in the presence of oxidative stress. Now simultaneously are also present smooth muscle cells. The smooth muscle cells are also present within the intima. In the presence of inflammatory mediators like interleukin 1 and the dysfunctional endothelium, in the presence of risk factors like diabetes mellitus, smoking, etc., what happens is you have increased expression on the endothelial surface of certain adhesion molecules. These adhesion molecules are substances are like the vascular cellular adhesion molecule, that is VCAM1. So you have oxidized LDL inside, and now because of risk factors there is increased expression of receptors which are present on the surface of this dysfunctional endothelium. Now what happens is that the monocytes which are present within the blood, they come and attach themselves onto these adhesion molecules and subsequently get internalized. Once internalized, the substances which are playing an important role are substances like monocyte chemoattractant protein 1, MCP1. This helps in the internalization of this monocyte. Once inside the intima, these monocytes are now called macrophages. These macrophages normally also have got some amount of scavengers on their surface, but once there is high amount of oxidative stress, once there is oxidized LDL, once there are risk factors, the number of scavenger receptors which are also present on the surface of the macrophages also gets propagated extremely high, and this oxidized LDL subsequently gets internalized into these macrophages, and you have what is formation of a foam cell. So ultimately what you have is a foam cell which is seen here. These are the foam cells, and subsequently you have got smooth muscle cell proliferation. So 2-3 things are happening in concert. The foam cells are being formed and there is smooth muscle cell proliferation which is occurring. Subsequently there is release of lipid from these foam cells into the extracellular matrix, and this released oxidized lipids along with the smooth muscle cells go on to form what is called a fatty streak. The fatty streak is the first part in the formation of atherosclerotic plaque, and this fatty streak subsequently just keeps on going higher and higher, and a plaque is formed. This is a more magnified view of the same process. The monocyte adhering to the dysfunctional endothelium by vascular cellular adhesion molecule, then penetrating inside because of monocyte chemoattractant protein. Once inside, this monocyte is called a macrophage, and they are activated by substances like the macrophage colony stimulating factor, and they undergo activation and subsequent division. They are converted, they uptake the oxidized LDL and are converted into foam cells. The lipid gets extruded, there is smooth muscle cell mitogens which just cause smooth proliferation, and you have a plaque. Now coming to the next slide, now what is the anatomy of an atherosclerotic plaque? The anatomy of the atherosclerotic plaque is that in the center it has a lipid core. Now this has got all the prothrombotic milieu which is present, and this is lying on the surface of your intima, and you have the lumen here. The atherosclerotic plaque has also got certain other components, which is the shoulder and the fibrous cap. Large amount of problems are also going on in this patient as regarding to the fibrous cap. Lot of metabolic changes are happening here, and the site of this break is usually at the shoulder. Once there is a breach in the shoulder, that will allow the blood to come in contact with the prothrombotic milieu. The fibrous cap would have broken down. There is exposure to the blood. You have got all clotting factors here, and you will have a clot formation. Large amount of work is going on into atherosclerotic plaque studies, and in fact you will be surprised to know there is a full site which is available on the internet on vulnerable plaques. Okay. Now coming to the next step, that is, as I told you, what is happening within the fibrous cap. Very important to understand. A very complex slide again, but often overlooked by the students. Now you have this lipid core which is here. You have these inflammatory T lymphocytes which are there. They secrete interferons which inhibit collagen synthesis. Number one, making the fibrous cap more thinner. If there is no structural element, obviously the cap would become thinner. Similarly, they cause release of certain substances like CD40 ligands, which then act upon the foam cell or the macrophages which are there, causing them to release certain collagen degrading proteins. Not only are they not allowing collagen to form, they are also indirectly causing release of collagen degrading proteinases which break down the collagen, again making the fibrous cap thinner. Not only is the T lymphocyte which is causing the macrophage to do all these problems, there are certain inflammatory mediators like interleukins, tumor necrosis factor, and macrophage stimulating factors which are causing all these problems to get propagated to a large extent. So, and as we all know, these are all inflammatory markers, and there is no doubt now that atherosclerosis is an inflammatory process. If you study these patients, they usually have got high C-reactive protein levels. That is why if you give them statins, you suppress the process of inflammation. So very important to understand this slide, because if you have a long question or if you have a short note or a viva voce, this will help you to understand what is the genesis of acute coronary syndrome. So a fatty streak just keeps on going up and up day by day, and one day you have the formation of a established plaque. Now there is a large lipid core, but you see the fibrous cap. The fibrous cap is quite thick and is protecting the lipid core from getting in interaction with the central lumen. So this is a stable plaque. It is an established stable plaque. Now plaques are broadly classified into two types. Either you could have a stable plaque or you could have an unstable plaque. Stable plaque we already saw has got a thick calcified cap and a smaller fatty core. Vis-a-vis, the unstable plaque has got a thin and vulnerable cap. The thin cap has been created because of the various metabolic changes that are happening, and this is the the thin vulnerable cap which will break up and will just explode and cause the acute coronary syndrome to happen. Apart from whatever changes are happening at the plaque level, the vascular endothelium cells has got multiple roles to play. It also helps to maintain a very important balance between anticoagulant and procoagulant mechanisms. The various anticoagulant mechanisms that are available are the release of substances like prostacyclin, thrombomodulin and heparin sulfates. Vis-a-vis, the procoagulants like von Willebrand's factor, tissue factor and plasminogen activity inhibitor. So not only is it getting affected by inflammatory process and getting deranged, it has to play a very important role. Supposing there were endothelial dysfunction, again these things are also hampered. It could go either way. So you have a perfect milieu which is now available, which could create problems. So a vulnerable plaque has been defined as a plaque which has got a high propensity to rupture. It is high in extracellular lipid. The lipid core occupies a large portion of the plaque. The degree of cross-sectional stenosis usually is less than 50%. It has got a thin fibrous cap and a high macrophage density. In fact, all of us should be very proud that a large amount of work into vulnerable plaque has been done by one Indian pathologist, Dr. Renu Virmani, who is at Armed Forces Center in America, although placed there. She is a well-respected figure and well-known person in histopathology as far as acute coronary syndromes are concerned.
Yeah, I think, sir, in this session we will stop here because time is not permitting us. In these sessions we have discussed mainly the plaque formation and the pathogenesis of the plaque formation, which is one of the major cause of the acute coronary syndrome. So in our next sessions will be started from the 15 minutes later on, and in that sessions we will discuss further about this topic, and we will meet after 15 minutes. Thank you very much.